The following work is brought to you by ScriptCrib. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon for more information on our works. And as always, if you want to know more about what we're doing and be up to date when we release it, always like and subscribe. He stared out into the streets of the city. Bodies were strewn about as the rays of the sun baked the corpses of those too proud to flee and too ignorant to listen. His youthful disposition was unfazed by the intense radiation. His eyes were still pure and innocent, his skin untouched by the harsh conditions. He walked through the street, looking at each person as he passed them, inspecting them for anything useful as well as seeing if they were alive. Though he found several valuable trinkets, or at least what he perceived to be valuable, none of the people he encountered were alive. They had long since met their makers, their skin being singed off minute by minute. In the distance, several large, four-wheeled transports moved through the city. Their appearance was easily distinguishable, though remarkably unfamiliar. He stared out as they trampled the bodies of the deceased, showing no reverence to those they once shared the planet with. On the sides of the transports, Poe was emblazoned with bold, yellow letters across the black armor. Several soldiers, all clad from head to toe in heavy, protective equipment, rode on the sides, scouting out along the streets for any survivors. "There's one!" shouted one of the soldiers from the top of the transport as he pointed to the young man. The soldiers turned the transport toward him and barreled forward, running over more of the deceased before reaching him. They snatched the young man up and tossed him into the back of the transport. Inside, in the near pitch-black, armored vehicle, several other children were sitting beside him, all with their skin pristine and their eyes innocent. The dimly lit tavern was bathed in a sickly neon glow, casting long shadows over the dusty floor. Raedok and Curaki made their way through the haze of smoke, past the huddled bodies of weary Outlanders seeking refuge from the harsh world outside. The crater was home to thousands of Outlanders, many just trying to survive until the next day. The tavern within the crater was a hub for all to exchange their stories and their experiences, all in the hopes of easing their burdens. After a few steps, Curaki and Raedok's eyes fell upon Abel and Uralt, nestled in a corner booth drinking hooch from grimy glass jars. "Found you," Curaki murmured, her ice-blue cybernetic eyes glinting mischievously as she slid into the seat beside her brother Abel. She plucked one of the jars from the table and took a hearty swig, savoring the bitter taste that burned her throat. "Can always count on you two to find the best seat." "Like moths drawn to a flame," Uralt grumbled, his deep voice resonating through the cramped space. His green eyes narrowed as he observed Raedok hesitatingly reach for a jar, only to set it back down untouched. "Still won't drink, huh?" Raedok shook her head, pushing a stray strand of her wavy black hair behind her ear. "It dulls the senses," she said quietly. "Prefer to stay sharp." Her piercing green eyes scanned the room, searching for any signs of danger. "Suit yourself," Abel said with a shrug, taking another swig from his jar. He leaned forward, his warm brown eyes locked with a serious tone. "We've got some news, and it's not good. Word has it Reginald Mitten's been captured by Poe." "Reginald?" Karaki's expression darkened, her gaze flickering with anger and concern. "How did they get him?" "Does it matter?" Uralt interjected, his massive hand gripping the scythe at his side. The faint whirring of the cybernetic implant in his wrist was barely audible over the din of the tavern. "What matters is that they'll have more information now. The raids are becoming more frequent, and it's only a matter of time before they find this place." "Can't we ever catch a break?" Abel lamented, rubbing his temples. Unlike the others, he had no cybernetic enhancements, a fact that both frustrated and motivated him. "A few months without Poe breathing down our necks would be nice." "Wouldn't we all want that?" Curaki muttered, her gaze wandering to the chipped edges of her glass jar. The memories of their past lives haunted them all, but she knew better than to dwell on it. Instead, she focused on the bond she shared with Raedok and her siblings, a loyalty forged through hardship and tragedy. "Let's just hope Mitten holds out long enough for us to get him back," Uralt said, his voice steely with determination. "We owe him that much." "Agreed," Raedok whispered, her eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "No one gets left behind." Karaki's cybernetic eyes flickered with the reflection of the dim tavern lights as she stared into the swirling ambered liquid before her. The hooch seemed to serve as a catalyst for past memories, and her mind wandered to the life she left behind. Her thoughts drifted toward her parents, tirelessly working in the energy sector, powering the cities that once thrived under the once harmless sun. "Remember how our parents used to come home after those long shifts?" Curaki asked, her voice soft with nostalgia. "Their hands would be stained with grease, but they'd always have a smile for us." Abel and Uralt exchanged somber glances, their own memories resurfacing. The sacrifices their parents had made were immeasurable, and ultimately, it was for naught. People like them were blamed for the sun turning on Earth, scorching its surface and forcing humanity into hiding. "Can't forget that day," Uralt murmured, his green eyes distant and haunted, "when we lost them to the radiation." Curaki shuddered at the memory, unable to shake the image of their parents' bodies frying under the merciless onslaught of gamma rays. They had been too afraid to step outside, fearing the same fate. Abel clenched his fists, the muscles in his arms tensing. 3 days, he whispered, almost choking on the words. 3 days we watched their corpses decay, helpless and trapped, until Raedok and Reginald Mitten came for us, Curaki added, her voice filled with gratitude. The 2 men, clad in full radiation suits, had provided them with protection and a transport to safety. It was a debt they could never fully repay. Reginald saved our lives, Uralt said, his voice firm with conviction. We can't let Poe take him from us. We have to do whatever it takes to get him back. Agreed, Curaki said, her resolve strengthened by the memories she held so closely. We owe Raedok and Reginald everything. Our loyalty to them runs deep, and we'll fight for them until our last breath. As they each held on to their fading past, a silent vow was exchanged between the siblings. The world had been unforgiving, but it also forged an unbreakable bond between them. Together, they would face the consequences of humanity's reckless experimentation with science, as they would survive, for themselves, for their fallen parents, and for those who had given them a second chance at life. Here's to survival, Abel whispered, raising his glass as a toast. Survival, Curaki echoed, clinking her jar against her brother's. The flickering neon lights of the tavern reflected off Kuraki's cybernetic eyes as she stared into the bottom of her glass jar. The hooch burned her throat, but it also ignited a spark of memory, one that took her back to her first days in the crater. Reginald Mitten and Raedok had given them a new life there, providing shelter and food when they had nothing left. Their generosity had not been without expectation. However, and as the siblings grew older, they found themselves serving and fighting against the very entity that had abandoned them, Poe. "Another round, please," Uralt called out to the bartender, his voice low and gravelly. Curaki glanced up at her brother, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his fingers tightened around his glass. It was clear he too was reminiscing, perhaps about the price they'd paid for their survival. As if reading her thoughts, Uralt turned to her with a pained smile. "You remember the day you lost your eyes, don't you? Those damn Poe bastards nearly killed you." "Every day," Curaki replied, her voice barely audible over the hum of the tavern. The memory of the battle was etched into her mind, the searing pain, the disorientation, and the darkness that followed. It was only through the skilled hands of syndicate surgeons that she had been given a second chance to see, albeit with cold, unfeeling machinery replacing her once warm, human eyes. "Your sacrifice saved us all that day," Abel spoke up, raising his jar in her direction. "I'll never forget how you fought, even with your injuries." "Survival," Curaki muttered, her thoughts turning to Uralt's own struggles. His muscles had been badly damaged in another skirmish against Poe, forcing him to undergo extensive cybernetic implants in his wrists and ankles to regain his former strength. She knew the surgery had been painful, but Uralt never complained, wearing his scars like badges of honor. "Survival," her brothers echoed in unison, raising their jars before downing the contents in one swift motion. As they continued to drink, Kuraki's thoughts wandered, tracing the path that had led them to this point in their lives. They had been given a chance to survive, but at what cost? Their bodies had been altered, their innocence lost, and yet they remained loyal to those who had saved them. In this twisted world, it seemed loyalty and survival went hand in hand, bound together by the consequences of humanity's reckless pursuit of knowledge. "Here's to Reginald and Raedok, our saviors," Curaki whispered, raising her jar once more. "May we return the favor," Uralt added, a determination flashing in his piercing green eyes. "By any means necessary," Abel agreed, his voice filled with steely resolve. By any means necessary, they repeated together, sealing a silent pact as they prepared for the battles ahead. The hooch burned their throats as they drank, with toast after toast to their allies and friends, its acrid taste a reminder of the strife that had brought them together, but with each wince of pain a celebration of their triumphs. The dim lights of the tavern flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls as the 4 friends sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Raedok's piercing green eyes drifted to her companions, taking in the scars and cybernetic enhancements that marked them as survivors. "Hey, Raedok," Uralt began, his voice low and thoughtful. "We've all been through hell and back, shared our stories with each other. Is it finally time for you to talk about your past?" Raedok's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze hardened as she shook her head. "There's not much to tell," she replied curtly, folding her arms across her chest defensively. Her eyes betrayed a flicker of pain, but she held her composure. "Come on," Curaki prodded gently, her ice-blue eyes glowing with concern. "We're family here. You can trust us." "Really, there's nothing worth sharing." Raedok's tone was firm, leaving no room for further discussion. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling as if willing herself to disappear from the conversation. Curaki, Abel, and Uralt exchanged glances before rolling their eyes in unison, knowing that pressing the matter further would only push Raedok deeper into her shell. They returned their attention to their jars of hooch, the bitter taste now tinged with the frustration of secrets left untold. As the liquid courage continued to flow, their minds wandered between memories of battles fought, loved ones lost, and dreams of a future free from the tyranny of Poe. The weight of their loyalty to the Syndicate lay heavy in their hearts, binding them together in a silent pact as they faced the unknown. Survival, Erlt murmured, his green eyes meeting those of his siblings. No matter the cost. By any means necessary, Abel echoed, his voice a mixture of determination and pain. Even if it means keeping secrets, Curaki added softly, her gaze fixed on Raedok, who continued to stare at the ceiling, her thoughts locked away behind a wall of silence. Especially then, Erlt agreed, raising his jar in a final toast to the unspoken burden they all carried. To survival. Survival, came the chorus of voices, their conviction unwavering as they clinked their jars together, sealing their resolve in the face of an uncertain future. Hey, the next part's going to begin in about 30 seconds, but if you're enjoying this and you like some more of our stuff, check out By Gods and Kings, Nethair, Ascension. Follow the story of one of the antagonists of By Gods and Kings, Nethair Mertrand. As the middle child of 5, Nethair was never poised for greatness. It would never be given to him, nor would it be offered. With 2 of his brothers priests to different gods, another a promising blacksmith with a hot temper, and his eldest brother a power-hungry narcissist, Nethair was forced to forge a path in the world. However, once he was able to make something of himself, would his family allow it, or try to take what he earned? Nethair Ascension is available on Amazon, and also on the By Gods and Kings Spotify channel, as well as the Scrib Crib Publishing YouTube channel. Now, back to our work. Several people stood in the center of Soda City, dancing frantically and waving their limbs rhythmically as music filled the air. Surrounded by several tall buildings, the opening in between the buildings was serving as the hub for jubilation, something that many of the citizens required. The music was very loud, making it near impossible for people to hear around them as white pills were passed along for people to take as needed. As the men and women danced around the turntable placed in the center of the square, several armed guards were stationed beside an alley as several men discussed the ways of the city. Zack leaned against a large crate as he looked on at the men standing around him. Samuel, a taller man with a pencil-thin mustache and slick black hair, stood in front of him wearing a black suit accented by a red tie. Beside him were 3 men, all carrying guns and wearing full Poe-style body armor. "Can I offer you a drink?" asked Samuel as he reached behind a crate and pulled out a small glass crystal filled with an amber liquid which Zack was quick to decline. "I heard about your incident with Poe earlier. Quite a pity, but good for you, kid. You can outrun the big bad bastards of this new world." He smirked as he looked around to see the people in the streets still dancing the night away. "It was a lucky break," he replied back. "Oh, it was it?" said Samuel as he walked in front of Zack. "I'm sorry, but I beg to differ. From what I've been told, you leapt from a building and dove into another one. I want that luck." Zack nodded. "Look, all I did..." "You did what no one else has done, kid," continued Samuel. "You escaped. You got a tremendous amount of skill and potential, and we'd love to put it to good use. You upset one of our competitors, too. Always a pleasure to hear that." Zack shook his head slowly, watching Samuel pace back and forth in front of him. "Look, I know where you come from," said Samuel, trying to convince Zack to help him. "I know you grew up on the streets and still, to this day, make it a point to feed the starving children out here. I get that, but you can't feed them when you don't have any food. I just so happen to have that." Zack stared out into the darkness, not wanting to look at Samuel. He could tell that something was off. "What do you want from me?" he asked hesitantly. "I need you to go into Poe headquarters and steal the designs for their sensor system," Samuel said as he slowly walked up behind Zack. "It would give us the upper hand here and help keep those kids safe." Zack shook his head in disbelief. "You want me to change the game? To make us as good as them?" He knew the risks of this mission, but his thoughts kept coming back to the plethora of food that Samuel had promised him if he completed it. He felt torn between his own safety and providing for the children, struggling with what decision was best. "I don't know." "Of course you do," exclaimed Samuel. "It's an easy decision. You get me those plans and those kids eat good for a month. It's a no-brainer." Zack hesitated, unsure if he wanted to risk his life on a mission that he felt was impossible. "I need a day to think this over," he said, trying to wrap his head around the entirety of what was being asked of him. Samuel slammed his drink down on the crate angrily, glaring at Zack. "You can't be serious, Zack. You really need time to decide about something like this. This reward is substantial." Zack bit his bottom lip and huffed loudly, clearly struggling with the decision. "We're not talking about breaking into a bank here. We're talking about going into Poe headquarters." Samuel paused for a moment, looking around at his friendly but determined crew. Finally, he turned back to Zack and raised an eyebrow. "Why wait? Samuel asked impatiently. What is it that makes you hesitate? Zack looked up at him with determination in his eyes. Because I don't think it can be done, he replied firmly. Samuel nodded and shrugged. Fine, have your day, he said harshly before grabbing Zack's arm and leading him out of the alley. Come on, he said as they walked toward the raving crowd in the center of the buildings. Forget about it for now and let's enjoy ourselves. Maybe some random girl will come along and make you forget about all this nonsense. The two walked out into the crowd to find the masses dancing in the night. I don't understand you, Zack, continued Samuel as they walked up to several ladies dancing in a circle around a large, yellow crystal. I'm offering you an opportunity to become more than you are, and you're here having to think about it. Zack smirked as he looked at the women approaching him. Samuel, it's not that I don't want to be more than I am, he began, smiling as the women started to touch him on the chest and his back. It's that I want to make sure I'm alive long enough to enjoy it. Zack kept moving forward into the crowd with the ladies keeping their hands on him. He escaped into the jubilating masses, leaving Samuel alone in the street with his men behind him. He smirked as he looked up into a gray, two-story building overlooking the crowd to find another man nodding at him. His long-brimmed hat and long coat were odd, and not something he had seen often within the confines of Soda City. With the many hands feeling his body, he couldn't help but feel a connection with the man staring down at him. Zack turned away from the man staring at him as the sound of Samuel's voice echoed over the jubilation. Kill the music, Samuel announced to the crowd. The women stepped away from Zack, all staring at him while splitting to allow Samuel to approach. That's not going to do, Zack, he announced as he moved through the crowd. Zack closed his eyes and exhaled sharply. He knew not to trust Samuel, just like many others who operated against society. I'm sorry, Zack, but I'm afraid I can't let you think it over. I'm also afraid I have nothing to offer you for your services. There's no food for the job. There's no money either. There's only what will happen if you don't get us those plans, continued Samuel ominously. Zack stepped forward and looked up at the building to see the man he was staring at earlier was gone. Instead, Jim, the man he previously fled from, was standing at the window and looking down on him. Zack sighed heavily with the realization that he had been double-crossed. I'm sorry, Zack, said Samuel as he looked up at the building with him. Turns out, he and I have a lot more in common with one another than we thought, and it also turns out that we both need those plans. Zack remained stoic and kept his eyes on Jim, who was staring down at him with an awkward, sinister grin. So what then? You're going to force me to risk my life for nothing. That's right, replied Samuel. I'm glad I don't have to spell it out for you. Zack looked down at the ground while a crowd of thugs walked around him. He turned his gaze away from Jim and back over to Samuel, staring at him with a look of scorn and disgust. He had been betrayed by someone who had helped him for years. He mulled over his options, but he couldn't think of any. He had to complete the job for Jim and Samuel now, and even then, his life would probably be forfeit afterwards. He could leave Soda City and head to one of the other cities in Eden, but it was probably moot. They would find him. He could head to the surface and try and live in one of the settlements, but getting there would be difficult. Suddenly, the world went black. Zack fell to the ground, unconscious from a blunt object slamming into the back of his head.